Empire. Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the John Conn Report wherever you get your podcast. You're watching on YouTube. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Empire Media. That's AMPIRE. Always much appreciated when you tune in. And don't forget, you can always read my work on ESPN.com. I have a story up now. One news story, which you're going to find out about in a minute. You probably already know about it now. But also a story on Cliff Kingsbury and what can we expect from a Cliff Kingsbury offense in Washington, and just what could he add here? But also, like, it's not going to be an easy turnaround for him, and I'll get into that in other podcasts. But there's a lot that has to come together right away because of just the newness of it, some of the youth, and a lot of the changes. Anyway, that story's up on ESPN.com, and the other one, of course, is Brandon McManus being released. Not a surprise. You could see this coming. I think the organization, they waited about a week they found out Monday when we all found out. They were not informed of this lawsuit when he signed here, even after he signed here, until it was filed late a week. It was late on a Friday night, and then it popped on Memorial Day. That's when the team knew what was going on. So not a great look for, not their fault. It's something that probably should have been told to them if you know this is coming. Anyway, he was released, and again, not a surprise. Now, did get a statement from his attorney, who said he maintains that the allegations against him are absolutely false and, importantly, are contradicted by indisputable evidence and the accuser's own prior inconsistent statements and omissions. We are disappointed with the team's decision to release Brandon, but before he had the opportunity to defend himself against these fabricated claims, we'll aggressively defend and clear Brandon's name and reputation through the legal process. Anyways, so for Washington, it's put him in a tough spot. We know the history of the organization here. It was not this group's fault at all, but there was going to be some sort of a trial, and it just put them in a tough spot. And I know they looked into things over the last week. And then with the players coming back on Monday, the veterans coming back on Monday, certainly made sense to have that decision made before they came back. So you don't want a guy flying here and then saying, hey, by the way, we're going to release you now, when you probably had some of that information available to you. I know Tony Busby was on with the Junkies last week saying they have, obviously witnesses, et cetera. So who knows? The bottom line is it probably either gets to court or this would be a tough situation for them. And I know there's a lot of talk about due process. The NFL does not always operate that way. That's not, with private companies, it's not whether you can disagree or agree with it or not. It doesn't matter. The court of law has to be that way. But with the private company, they operate differently. So that's whether, again, you can agree or not. I'm just stating a fact. So anyway, don't shoot the messenger on that one, folks. But the bottom line is now they need a kicker. I don't know who's coming in yet. I do know there are a couple of guys out there. Randy Bullock is out there. You also got the UFL guy, Jake Bates. Now, he's an interesting one because he hadn't kicked since he didn't kick in college. He was like a kickoff specialist. So it had been a while since he kicked, and he was 17. I think his team is out he's played for Michigan in the UFL. He's 17 for 22. Now, of those 5 misses, 4 are from 50 yards or longer. He's kicked six of his field goals are from 50 plus yards. 3 are from 60 plus. So I know he's a guy that NFL teams have been paying attention to. Could he be brought in? Possibly. Randy Bullock is another guy, like I said, a veteran kicker, but I would keep this in mind. At that position, I don't think it's very possible that whoever comes in now is not the guy who opens the season here, because there are definitely teams that have a couple kickers in camp, and they, the loser of those competitions will be available to Washington. As an example, what do I have the numbers here? When they signed, Dustin Hopkins was September. That's when he signed here. When in the year he signed, Tress Way was August. Graham Gano was in December. Point is, guys that ended up stayed here for a little bit were guys that signed way after this point. So whoever they sign, just know that at that position, there's a decent chance that the eventual guy would be signed after some cuts are made in August. So be patient with that one. Now, it's going to kind of leapfrog me into some of the other things I was going to talk about. In fact, I was talking about when the news about McManus broke. In fact, I was halfway through a taping, and again, I knew this was going to happen probably early in the week, or not new. We were certainly prepared for it to happen very early in the week. So when it happened, it's not a surprise, but I was taping something else at the time. So then you got to stop and you turn in the newser and then you go. So anyway, it does kind of mesh with this because it's all about left tackle and cornerback. Those are two big spots that are remaining in question marks on this roster. What can they do about that now? There's always this talk, as I record this is June 2nd. So always the June cuts. Oh, the guys will be available. Well, the guys that you want are usually released before this point. They might be designated a post June 1 cut, but they've probably already been released. I was looking at the last couple of years of guys that have been cut in June. You're not really getting a lot of guys that are going to be these quality starters for you. Akeem Hicks was one guy that ended up being picked up I think it was last year or 2 years ago. And he ended up becoming a guy who started a little bit. And then 2 years ago was Akeem Hicks, started 11 games for Tampa Bay. Pittsburgh signed Larry Ogunjobi 2 years ago after he was cut. And he was a June signee. He started 33 games the last 2 years for them, 4.5 sacks. He had 10 tackles for loss in his 2 years. He had 12 in the year before Pittsburgh picked him up. So the point is, like, those are some of the guys that you look at and say, okay, these are some of the starters coming out of that. So it's really hard to get a guy. And so the notion that they can just wait and see who gets released at left tackle, for example, it's going to be difficult. So even I was looking at a lot of the teams that drafted tackles. There aren't a lot of options there. So one of the interesting ones would be the Jets. They signed Tyron Smith, they signed Morgan Moses, and they drafted a tackle. But when you talk to people up there, like, it doesn't sound like they're going to release any of those guys. Smith has had injury issues. Moses is obviously it would be a right tackle. But you want to keep some of those guys around. It did not sound like they had any intention of releasing anybody, certainly at this point. And I don't know that they would, because it seems like they want to have that kind of depth. Chargers drafted a guy. No, they don't have anybody that you would really want. The Titans drafted J.C. Latham. They don't have anybody that you want. They had a rookie starting at tackle last year. He kind of struggled. That's why they ended up drafting a tackle. Again, I just gave the Jets. The Saints drafted a guy. They have Trevor Penning, a former first-round pick, but he was benched. So would he really be a solution? Cincinnati, they drafted Amaris Mims. They have Orlando Brown and Trent Brown. Trent Brown signed this offseason. They're not going to cut him. Orlando Brown kind of struggled. So, and the line has been very bad in Cincinnati. So the point is, it's difficult. So I think the key here is, and I'll give some other teams, Pittsburgh drafted someone. They really don't have anybody. Green Bay drafted Jordan Morgan. They have Rasheed Walker, who was left tackle last year, got better. And I know they had David Bakhtiari, but injuries have destroyed that guy's the last several years of his career. So you really can't go that route. Houston, Blake Fisher, they had Titus Howard, Kansas City, left tackle is a question mark for them even. They kind of have a good quarterback, so it's okay. But they did draft Kingsley Sumiata, and I think he's going to battle in training camp. But I don't know, that it doesn't sound like they would release the guy that he's battling with, because he started last year. So it's a hard place to go. Now, there are some possibilities. There are a couple possibilities. One, first of all, Cornelius Lucas, we know what he can do, right? We've seen what he can do. He can hold down the fort for 5, 6, 7 games. And then is Brandon Coleman ready? Now, I know a lot of people think he could be better as a guard, or at least some certainly think that. I had Greg Cosell on. He felt like that. But one thing I always like about Greg is he doesn't pretend that he knows it all. He has an opinion, but he respects what other people how they may see it differently. And in this case, he's like, I see him more as a guard. They like him as a tackle. Well, we'll see who's right. And I know some other teams liked him as a guard, but I did talk to someone, a line coach I really respect, who felt like he could play tackle. And we know if you listen to the podcast with Coleman's college coach on here, which I had, I think, a week or two ago, he feels like he could be that left tackle is his best spot. Now, when you look at him, he looks he's a sturdy guy, right? He looks built a little bit more like a guard, but he is 6'4" and change. And so like that's part of it, but his length is tackle like it's a good length for a tackle. For example, I think it was at the combine, he had his arm length was in the top 10 of tackles at the combine. His height was in the bottom 4 or 5. And so that's why, but the length is there. So I think that helps him. And he's an athletic guy. He's a good basketball player. He's an athletic guy that helps with the footwork. So I think he's got a chance. The hard part is for them, they don't know, they're not going to know what he can do until we get to training camp. Like you can see these guys in OTAs, but until you put pads on for the linemen, it's really, really difficult to get. You don't get any sense. So not even really difficult. It's impossible because they know it. And so like even in practice, they're not really doing a whole lot with those groups as far as like getting a really good measuring stick. You can see the athleticism, you can see the footwork, working on all that, but until you get the pads on, it's a really hard thing to measure. And that's one reason why I'm glad that they have these 2 OTA practice or joint practice sessions with the Jets on August 8th up in New York and with the Dolphins on August 15th in Miami, that you get, I like having, it's funny because like last year they did 2 days with the Ravens. I have no issue with that whatsoever, but I do like going against different teams as well. So then he'll be able to play in the preseason game. So it's a little bit like getting 2 extra preseason games for a guy like Coleman to help him develop. And I think, then you get a better sense of what can he do and maybe how long might it take him to get there. And that kind of dovetails into the possible guy that you would look at down the road is DJ Humphries. Why? Because he's got a history with Cliff Kingsbury. I mean, he coached him in Arizona. He has a really good reputation in the locker room. His issue, of course, is he tore his knee, and I think it was on New Year's Eve. So he's not going to be ready for the start of the season. But if you think that, if they view if they view Lucas certainly as a stopgap, and I know he's been a good swing tackle here. And the book on him is that the more he plays, it's like you get more exposed. That's why he becomes a good backup. But, do they see him differently? And more importantly, how quickly do they think Coleman could ascend to being a starter at that position? I know we have Braden Daniels that we haven't talked about, but man, did he look far away last year. So, you can sit there and wonder about him. However, I think that would be a tough one to expect him to improve that much. I think Coleman's tape from college was better than Daniels, certainly. So I would, and this is the guy that they picked, whereas Daniels they're inheriting. So that always makes a difference. But you can throw him in the mix, see what he has, but you're certainly going to put the other 2 way ahead of that going into camp for sure. But again, Humphries would be a guy that if they look at Lucas like, okay, 5 or 6 games and you got to get someone in there, and maybe Coleman isn't ready. Well, maybe by October, maybe they feel Humphries would be ready. And maybe that's a guy that, they could bring in, because again, they're very big on familiarity, as we know, and they are familiar with him for sure. Donovan Smith is out there, a lot of penalties. His play has regressed, not as good in run blocking as he had been in the past. And so I don't know that you look at him as a great solution. But I think Humphries would be one. And again, they've got to see what they have in Coleman first. You've got to see, because they drafted him for a reason. So we'll see. But anyway, so that's part of it. And maybe somebody gets released in camp along the lines of, well, you never know. It's been hard for this team. I mean, Charles Leno was an aberration for what they look for. And since I've covered this team, you don't typically get a lot of starting position players at an impact position for sure, where you can say, okay, he came in and did this. I mean, they've had some guys come in. Will Blackman came in after, final cuts and did a nice job, guys like that. But I'm talking about a good starter at a premium position. And, Will Blackman was a corner. But we're talking left tackle here. And I think it's going to be hard to find that guy after this point. So you need to really work on developing them, but keep Humphries in your back pocket as a possible, in case of emergency, break glass situation, and just monitor it. Like, I would have to monitor that situation, because it would make sense if he's healthy that he could be a possible solution for them if they think Coleman might take a minute to develop. and that's okay. Like if they feel like he might not be ready till next year or to be a full-time starter, okay, get through the year. But if you feel like, you know what, this kid's pretty smart, he's got good feet, he's got length, you can make something of him by middle of the year or whatever, then that's going to be different too. So, and the other thing too with that offensive line, it's not always obviously you want to get really good talent on there. To me, what they need to start seeing is continuity. 2 years ago, look at the line from even 2 years ago. There are going to be 3 guys that remain from the offensive line from 2 years ago: Cosme, Lucas, and Chris Paul. Like that's it. Those are the guys that were here 2 years ago who could factor this year. Last year, you have 5 guys who, among the final roster, whatever, that, and that includes like Wiley and Trent Scott too. So those 3 plus these 2. But the point is, you need continuity to become a good line. And that's why whatever they start off as, we'll see where they go, because it's continuity, it's chemistry, and it's all that stuff. I mean, the Hogs didn't have 5 first-round picks, but they had really good continuity and phenomenal chemistry. And then they were very well coached. So it takes all that stuff. Can this group get there? Well, it's kind of a lot to ask in the beginning. And then with the rookie quarterback, you obviously want them to be there. It's one of the bigger questions going into camp for sure. And I do think having a quarterback like Jaden Daniels can help, because he can get you out of bad situations. But it's going to, and I think you can help by getting a good run game going, but it doesn't solve all. At some point, those tackles have to sit there and pass block in one-on-one situations. You cannot compensate on every snap. So they need to find those guys, but in the meantime, can you still build a winning team? Can you still have a good offense? Trades, free agents, quarterbacks, and all kinds of adventures await the Commanders this offseason. Looking for an adventure of your own? The Adventure Park at Sandy Spring has you covered. The country's largest ropes course and zipline park, located in Montgomery County, Maryland, is now open. Named Best Amusement Park and Climbing Destination in the DMV 2 years in a row, the Adventure Park at Sandy Spring is perfect for birthdays, corporate outings, groups, and families. With challenges anywhere from beginner to expert, there is something for all skill levels. Anytime you're thinking about reaching new heights, make sure you know before you go. The Adventure Park at Sandy Spring is the only ACCT accredited park in Maryland or Virginia. Staying on the ground, give axe throwing a try. You can throw at traditional targets or play any number of interactive games. You can even upload your own image. So there you have it, folks. Climbing, ziplining, axes, food, and bonfires right in your backyard. Reserve your adventure today at www.theadventurepark.com/Kime. That's www.theadventurepark.com/Kime. But here's the other thing, and I'm going to get into this other podcast, but this offense is not set up for instant success because a new coordinator, new quarterback. You may have 6 new starters on that line, on that offense, which doesn't translate to overnight success. But you got to get that line fixed. And if they want to do anything going forward, that line will become a bigger priority. And my guess is, who knows, but I'm getting way ahead of ourselves. But next offseason, I would expect that to become an even bigger priority. But again, a lot of that depends on where does Coleman go. So that's a thing there at tackle. I am curious more to see what can Coleman do. I'm not going to jump to any conclusions before seeing the kid with pads on against an NFL defensive lineman. So far, we have not seen that. I have watched the tape. I think there's some good things to like. I think he's athletic. And again, I think he has good length. Those are good things for an offensive tackle. So, and if in the future he becomes a really good guard, that's fine too. 3rd round pick becomes a really good offensive lineman. That's a really good situation. But we all know that left tackle situation is one of the big question marks going into training camp. Now, corner is another. So what are they going to do there? Because I don't know, I don't know their true thoughts on guys like Forbes and St. Juste, the holdover guys that could go in and start. I know that Dan Quinn likes guys who can take it away, as does Joe Witt. Well, that's Forbes. That's what Forbes did in college. I don't know, like with St. Jude's, the tape wasn't good last year, and in some of the ways that they would want to play, which is a lot of press. However, it's funny because I was talking about someone about this the other day. Just sometimes you may have an opinion of a guy watching him on film, like a St. Jude's. The film wasn't great. But then you come in here, you get this in your notion, like, okay, maybe he's not going to be a big help here. But then you see a guy who has good length and good size. And that's one thing that Dan Quinn really prizes in his outside corners. I say outside because Mike Samerstill is not that guy. He's he's a slot guy. But on the outside, he likes the taller corners, guys with length. And, Forbes is a good height, not size, but height. Mike Davis, good size for a corner. So that's something to watch there. Like, what do they think of him? Because there are corners out there that are interesting. Stephon Gilmore certainly would be a guy that you'd have to look at because, again, familiarity. These guys, the Joe Witt and Quinn coached him in Dallas last year. Now he's coming off he had torn labrum surgery for torn labrum in January. I think he's still rehabbing that. And I believe he's still living in Dallas or working out in Dallas or whatever, rehabbing in Dallas, whatever he's doing. But he's a guy that if they want to go sign another corner, he'd have to be on that list of guys you would at least have to consider. I know Xavier Howard, he's also free, and he has a reputation as a good man corner, but his play didn't. And one of the things that he clashed with in Miami with former defensive coordinator Vic Fangio was he wanted to play more man, but his play certainly has not been that great over the last 2 years. And he's I believe he's 31, and I don't know. I think there's some injury history there too. I'm reading a text from someone I was asking about him. However, can he still start? I think he probably could. The thing I always wonder with a guy like that, because he doesn't know, there's not the same level of, there's not the same. And when I say they don't have many connections, I couldn't find, when I went back to look at it, I couldn't find any connections in terms of higher ups in the front office or on the coaching staff who would have worked with Howard. So, or been with the Dolphins with him. But again, injuries, age, play has been declining, but he is considered a good man corner, or had been in the past. And that's what this team wants to play more of. So, but I think the lack of familiarity might be a bigger factor for him. And then you also wonder, you get to this stage in your career, if you're going to wait and sign, maybe you just wait at this point. You just wait and see in August what contending team might need a guy to come in and help. And that's, I think Gilmore could be that kind of guy as well. Or maybe he just ends up staying in Dallas once he's rehabbed. But I think that could be a hard one. There's also, I think Steven Nelson is also out there, and he's been in the past, he's done better in man coverage. But I don't know. I'm trying to find my notes, what I wrote down about him. And, but he's not, I don't know where he'd be at on it, but he's another guy to watch. But is he a guy that, like, did you just sign that kind of guy with a Mike Davis, and maybe you're just better off watching to see how St. Jude plays in your system or with your coaching? And the same with Emmanuel Forbes. That's why we always talk about him. It's, but both of them have to develop, because I don't care which one develops. You have a guy that, in Davis, that these guys know. Now you got to get a guy with one of these other guys who could also develop, because if not, then you're also, you're going to weaken your team. And those are two pretty important positions, tackle and corner, that you need. But yeah, like I said, with Nelson, better man coverage. Adoree Jackson is out there. We saw what he did with the Giants. And again, is another guy that has played more man coverage. And again, that's what this team wants. But Jackson last year and the year before, a lot of missed tackles. That was a big issue. Did not handle the deep ball very well. So, the options are, that's why I say you've got to coach these guys up. And we'll see. I've made a big deal out of saying that this defensive staff, I just think, is better. It's by a decent amount. But what impact will that make on the corners? And can they get them there? Will you apply enough pressure? But the other thing is, That's why, like, you're going into the season, we'll get into reasonable expectations in other podcasts, but you can't go into the season thinking, oh my God, NFC East title, here you come, because there's still more. It's not that they can't play better than you think, but they're just questions that have to be answered at very key positions. And I think, like, this is something I think we saw. The drafts have not been good. And the result is that they haven't replenished the roster, and they need to replenish the roster. And it's, and to get that in one offseason, it's a little bit hard. So we'll see what they can do with that, but how much impact will the coaching make? And I'd say the same thing at the offensive line. Now, Bobby Johnson, I mean, he's not a guy that you would say is one of the top offensive line coaches, but we'll see what he can do. And they have Darnell Stapleton, who has a reputation of being good with developing young linemen. So that bodes well, because they do have some young linemen to develop. Can they play tackle? Like, I like Stromberg, I think, can do well inside. You have Mason Brooks, who I would think is going to be interesting to watch what he does, but he's inside. And so I think the outside guys that you have to develop would be Coleman. And then can you get Daniels to a point where maybe he can be a contributor this year, for sure. So anyways, that's why, but listen, that's why you pay coaches a lot of money. My point in all this is saying some of the best options they have might be on their roster, and they just have to make it work and find a way to make it work, while other guys maybe become available later, like a DJ Humphries, or again, like if they really go hard after Gilmore and he decides he wants to come up here, okay. But some of these guys, again, I have a feeling might be waiting to see what contending team might open up in August. Some of these other guys may not have much choice but to sign with whomever. And if you give them a good deal, you get a good deal. So anyway, that's all I got, folks. They'll be back. The veterans will be back to OTA work this week. We will be out there on Wednesday. We will talk to the assistant coaches on Thursday, all the assistant coaches. So we'll get a lot of good intel for you guys this week. And I will be back with another episode on Wednesday morning, and then I'll do a wrap up of the OTA work later that day. So I'll talk to you next time.